So, one of the key tenets to leveraging AI for automation in our world is a test driven process. So, we actually call it test driven automation. And so, one of the first things you should and can be doing with AI is using it to generate the test cases for those areas where you don't have test case coverage today that will allow you to identify the current behavior of the system and then ensure that the migrated system does the same thing.
Welcome to It's About Data, episode 24. This time we're joined by Ryan Gross of Calent to discuss database modernization bottlenecks. All right, Ryan, welcome. You're Ryan Gross, you're head of data and AI at Calent, and recently you published a report on database modernization bottlenecks, which is right up our alley for It's About Data. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So this is something we commissioned because we've been helping customers migrate databases onto the cloud. And more recently, they're looking to do that in a way that they're not just taking it lift and shift to the exact same, whether it's the same platform, could be a managed service, could even be going across database engines. And so we were trying to validate some of the things we were seeing ourselves more broadly in the market. We went out, surveyed a number of IT leaders here, and got back the results, and really underneath of that, trying to understand on their most complex migrations, what were the challenges they ran into. Most of those complex migrations turned out to be modernization efforts. And so that's really what the survey reported on.
Yeah, and really fascinating findings. And what I want to do is ask you is just what are some of the chief problems, but I'll just list some of the things that go through some of the laundry lists that you folks found, which is talk about underestimating the complexity of the job. Gee, that does kind of shock me, doesn't it? A lot of manual legwork. There's just not enough automation at the right places or at the right stages. And not enough testing, inadequate resources, overconfidence that we've got the skills. So that was just a laundry list. What were the top two or three that really stuck out here that really made an impression?
Yeah, I mean, I think the three biggest ones to me, the first one, somewhat of confirmation, but even more so than I think we expected going in, was that only 6% of the survey respondents here completed their migration on the original timeline that they had planned. And then underneath that, when you dig into the details, 34% or more took more than a month longer than they anticipated. So not just like, oh yeah, it took us till the second day after we thought because somebody took PTO, but like a significant delay in many of these projects. And we can go into a lot more of the details behind why that might be later. The second one was, as companies made these migrations, we had the theory that they were doing it primarily to help save on licensing cost, but actually a significant portion of respondents increased their licensing costs as the result of the migration effort.
Interesting.
And the interesting, like underneath of that, some of that's just the pricing models from the database vendors, but some of it is just because they're then likely consuming more. They were doing it to, avoid scaling bottlenecks. And once they unbottlenecked themselves, they had to spend a little bit more, which then, results in another opportunity for them. And then the last one was around using AI in the migration process. It's actually something that's reasonably common in today's world, and that companies that did use it had a much better outcome, much better happiness with that outcome as well than those that didn't. That definitely mirrors our experience as well, as we've been kind of reframing the entire modernization process around something that's AI driven. But the fact that that difference was so stark was another interesting finding in there.
That's interesting. So I do have some questions about how AI is being used in these migrations, and I'm going to go back to my own experience doing database migrations. Our finding is that to kind of draw a parallel with automation, when you started using automatic SQL translation tools between database engines, they would mostly work, but there were always edge cases they wouldn't get, right? And so it could often turn into death by 1,000 paper cuts. Like it wouldn't your SQL wouldn't handle nulls quite the same way, which meant that the output data wasn't exactly the same, and it would start messing up report statistics, right? And so I would anticipate that maybe using AI, that could be an even bigger issue because you're using a probabilistic tool. So I guess the question is, how are those tools being used? And then how do you address those kind of edge cases that are always a problem for even humans, but with automation especially?
Yeah, I do think so. I'm going to first go into like the way that we're doing
Yeah.
it internally, but then I can try to broaden out based on what we saw in the survey. So one of the key tenets to leveraging AI for automation in our world is a test-driven process. So we actually
Mhm.
call it test-driven automation.
Mm.
And so one of the first things you should and can be doing with AI is using it to generate the test cases for those areas where you don't have test case coverage today that will allow you to identify the current behavior of the
Got
system
it.
and
Yeah.
then ensure that the migrated system does the same thing. In most
Okay.
cases here, when you're doing this type of modernization, you can do a like for like, and then you may have to go down and like optimize things that don't make any sense. Like you used a table valued parameter with 100 things in it when you probably should have just created a different table. And, so there's the like broader
Okay.
re-architect. It could be a second phase, but that step is absolutely essential. And you can do it in more interesting ways than just having generative AI guess, although that gives
Yeah.
you code coverage because for the most part, no one has unit tests on database code. Like
Yeah.
we have
No, agree.
into a company that has more than like 15% coverage there.
Oh, I'm surprised to see 15% coverage. I hate to say that. It should exist, right? And that's where this whole like data contracts movement comes in and things. But
Mhm.
yeah, we're not there yet.
And so, yeah, if that's step one, then step two is when you look with what generative AI models can take into context as compared to the rules based transformation
Right.
approaches from the past, they can simply use a lot more of the procedure and its dependencies. Like it might be a procedure that happens to call three functions, and each of those two other functions. Like, so bring that whole set of code into scope. And then one of the things we've had to build up for sure over time here is a set of like instructions and guidelines that condition on the code itself and have the best practices for like XML handling across SQL Server and Postgres are very different approaches. And so you've got
Yeah.
some complex mapping needed there. And a laundry list of other edge cases you run into because really the customers looking to do those types of projects likely have an old school legacy database that
Oh,
got
for
built
sure.
in
That's why
890
yeah.
and built for 20 years.
Well, that's just it. I mean, they would have migrated before if they didn't have something very legacy, right? And so now you're trying to go from a very old system to potentially a very modern one like Snowflake or Redshift, where the semantics, it's still SQL, but it's columnar, no indexes, like things change dramatically.
For
You know,
sure.
actually, let me try and jump in there because you're talking about the legacy databases. A lot of
Yeah.
times, of course, a lot of cobwebs there, and probably always
Yes.
not necessarily well documented. And what I'm
Mhm.
wondering is, have you and your clients encountered any success using generative AI to kind of decipher, the
Yeah, I
schemas?
guess it's true. Thank you. I left that step out of the
Yeah.
process there. But up front, that is how, like, if you're trying to build an estimate for this that you're not going to miss by a month or more, you, in these scenarios where you're moving across platforms, need to look at all that code. Now, the great thing about a database is it will actually spit back out all the code that it has in a well structured form. And for the most part, it has to be one procedure does one set of functionality. There's not as much interdependency as there is in an application code base, for instance. And so we do use generative AI up front to look at all of that. We map it against that knowledge base I was talking about before of stuff we've seen before to go generate an estimate of what it's going to take to do a migration across platforms based on what's our hit rate on knowledge that we've successfully done this before versus
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
that new. And then we throw our deepest experts at okay, well, here's that 15% that we're going to have to go figure out this time. Let's get ahead of it, craft customized knowledge and instructions in.
Got it. Got it. And what's interesting to me too is the way you're talking about using Gen AI here. There's the mathematician Terrence Tao. It's funny he was talking about this, but he was actually kind of referencing the tech industry in Gen AI, and he said, in security you have this notion of a blue team and a red team, and the red team's job is to actually break things. And his opinion was that in general, Gen AI was much better at breaking things than just building whole systems. And so that's why I really like this idea of using it to build tests. The point of tests is to show where things are broken, right? Maybe they're not exactly right, but if they fail, you can at least go check and say, oh, it hallucinated this detail. Let's fix that. And then do another iteration of the test. But more often than not, you're probably going to find that there is actually a problem with that data that's identified somehow that you can then go in and fix.
Yeah. And that is like, there is some level of correlation, although it wasn't like extremely significant
Yeah,
between AI use and downtime in the report, like in the survey data there,
got it.
that, the downtimes were slightly higher. for those that were using AI. And you could see that potentially as that type of, hey, we used AI without as much testing, therefore
Right.
we
Right.
went through things more quickly, we felt a little better about it, and then got bit at some point in the future. But it's not 100% clear that that's the case.
Yeah. Well, and I think in that downtime section as well, as I recall, you talk about how hard cutovers just tend to go worst, right? The idea that
Yeah.
you're just going to shut down the old system and then start the new one, and then everything's going to work. And that's my experience too. Like I've rarely seen that type of migration go well. Like
Yeah.
in practice, it's much better if it's a gradual migration, including doing things before you even start migration, saying, "Oh, no one's accessed this table for 2 months. Let's just cut off access and let's see who screams. We'll leave it still in production." And that's the thing. Like doing a full lift and shift, like you're saying, it just generally is a bad idea because there are so many cobwebs. And if you can start by just like getting rid of a lot of cruft and then rebuilding the stuff that makes sense, including using AI tools, it just makes so much more sense.
Yeah. And so that anything that we can do to chunk up, or really that anybody can do to chunk up that migration
Yeah.
into modules and get an entire module built, tested, integration tested,
Right.
and then launched. Like you have to make some changes then at the app code layer or the
Yeah.
BI tooling layer to enable that. But that type of repository pattern where you can point some things at the new database, some things at the old database, right? A different version of your colors there. You think about a blue-green setup where you've got
Right.
some things going on one side, some things going on other. You've cut over from one over time to the other.
Yeah. And even though the database itself is a kind of monolith, right? You're interfacing with Redshift or Oracle or whatever. It's more like a microservices approach, right? Where you're just treating each table and each transformation and each layer as sort of a microservice. Say, all right, everyone needs to cut over to this new table. If you're using the old version, we're going to cut off your access in 5 days, make sure the new one works. And then if it doesn't, you need to let us know.
Yep. Yeah. And you'd be surprised how often like 60% of the code base in a database is not used by anyone.
It's crazy, right? Like,
That is a good starting point. Like if you're planning a migration right now and you're looking at this thing and saying there's 2,500 procedures in this database,
yeah.
take a good hard look at which ones of those have been called in the last month or two,
Well,
and then just delete those ones and see if anybody comes yelling.
it's kind of like human DNA, but our DNA actually
a
is
lot of cruft. Yeah.
exact. There's a lot. I mean, we have a mechanism for adding things, so we don't seem to have a mechanism for deleting things. It sounds like databases are people too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny too to think about corporate IT budgets, and actually old Banyu, who talks a lot about metadata and such, said this in his book Fundamentals of Metadata Management. But you go into these organizations and there's so many different IT systems and tables and data sources, and no one even knows what they are, but people are so afraid to touch them because something might fall over if you touch the wrong one. Right?
Yeah. And that's almost exactly what you're talking about, the ability to turn that off. And for the most part, when you haven't called it in a month, you're not likely to take down a production system when you delete that one. So don't just go use the who screams loudest method on everything,
Right.
but take a multi-step process on that. And yeah, you can. Like we actually had one of our customers called Arbor Gold, where we found like almost 75% of their code was unused. And between that and then the AI automation, it ended up taking like 90% less time than originally planned to
Wow.
go do that cutover.
Yeah. And it also means that in terms of, it's a big mentality shift to go from CapEx spending to OpEx spending to saying, oh, we're going to spend on ETL based on how much ETL we have, right? We'll use credits based on ETL we have versus I bought this huge system. I'll just let it run all night and won't worry about the details. And that's where there can be efficiencies in these migrations. Like if you can cut out 90% of that ETL work, then the number of credits you're spending will just drop dramatically.
That's actually a good seg, which is like, to what are some of the lessons that you've learned or that your clients have learned as you did the study?
Yeah, I think we hit on before of modularizing and breaking down into chunks so that you can incrementally migrate. That's definitely one. The intelligent use of AI with, really testing as a baked in part of the process has been one of the other key ones that made this move a lot faster. I do think that people underestimate the complexity of just doing the data portions of cutover on big complex systems. And so that ability to do that last mile data streaming, so you've done your large scale data migration into the production system. If you have a high transaction 24/7 zero downtime system, then that incremental streaming of all of the data through that cutover period requires careful planning, like game day scenarios that if something goes bump, how are you going to make sure that that thing gets caught back up? Um, those types of scenarios were clear in the survey as well, because a lot of times it was that migration onto the cloud, not even necessarily across database platforms, that was the most complex or led to the most downtime. And I think it's because of that, right? When you're moving the data itself across, if something goes wrong and you're in the midst of trying to cut over, now you've got to go into failback mode or fallback mode.
Right. And this kind of sort of segs into essentially one of the findings that you had, which is that a lot of teams were probably a little overconfident in terms of their capabilities. Where do you see the skills gaps, and where does basically, where do you see basically, the role of, let's say, outside experts like yourselves, coming in, picking up where internal teams' expertise
Yeah,
leave off?
it is one of those things that, like, it's not a regular course of business for most companies unless you just happen to have thousands of applications and you have an internal team that's essentially consulting within your organization, moving around,
Mhm.
running these
Mhm.
to do this type of migration and cutover activity. And so, working with whether it's your cloud service provider and their account teams that can help you with that migration because they've done it a lot, or partners like us that can come in and, this is the bread and butter of our business in helping companies to go adopt these cloud services. So we just have people that have gone from 3 or 4 other client projects right before yours doing a similar thing. The skills gap there varies based on what you're talking about. So one is if you're moving into like a managed service, there are not known issues, but right limitations compared to run it yourself database engines. And so understanding what those are, which ones apply in your system, and what the workarounds are so that you can still get the same functionality, even if you're staying on the same database platform. And then for those that are moving across database platforms, it's very rare to find people that are experts in more than one database system, right? DBAs tend to have their core platform that they are experts in, and they're not necessarily Oracle and Postgres experts and understand the key differences between the ways you handle things in a performant way across both platforms. And so that type of person tends to consolidate into technology services consulting type
Yeah.
firms, simply because there isn't enough demand for their skills within any one company, and therefore they work with many companies in parallel. And we've restructured our teams such that some of those deepest experts in the in the weeds transformation are in like a tier 3, and they help across a wide variety of projects, so that we're not wasting their time on the minutia of the data movement and the basic things that AI can
Yeah.
handle.
That makes sense. I mean, often they're there more for triage, right? It's like, okay, what are the top issues here that we need to solve for this migration? What have you seen doing these migrations in the past as a consultant? Like what can you say top level to advise my team on how to fix these problems even before we run into them? Yeah.
Yep,
And that's a very
exactly.
rare
And that
skill set. Yeah.
right, because AI is able to take out some of the just basic work and accelerate that, we can bring in more people there. And then clients are certainly not trying to pay full time for the entire
Right.
SME role at the rate that that would charge for that entire 4 or 5 month migration project.
It's funny because basically, I mean, there've always been database migrations, but I say with the cloud, that obviously is increased. The
Mhm.
pace of this and the incidence of this. So hopefully, I think from all this, I see a few rays of hope here. One is practice makes perfect,
Yep.
or it gets closer to perfect, but also that AI can hopefully, as long as we don't try and put too much faith in it, they can hopefully get us over some of these usual pitfalls. They can do a lot of that legwork that might that humans may
Yeah,
underestimate.
as long as you're using it up front to try to think through that testing portion,
Yeah.
and it can help you solve for the rest of the
You know,
pitfalls that it might create down the line.
Yeah.
gotcha. Well, Ryan, thanks for taking time to share some of your wisdom here. So I'm sure we could go on for a few hours about this, but hopefully we stoked enough curiosity here, so we can take the discussion further.
Absolutely. I was told 7 or 8 hours here, but that's fine. I think we
Okay. Sorry to disappoint. Sorry to disappoint. And yeah,
It's
ping
Labor
us
Day weekend coming up.
and ping us when you have other data studies coming out. There might be future conversations to have here.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just one I had mentioned before. That ability
Yeah.
to transform and translate the actual structure of the data is
Yeah.
like a phase 2 right after this, and that one's another interesting problem set.
Sounds good.
Excellent.
Thanks very much for joining us, Ryan.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Take care.